At the will reading, my grandmother left me her entire estate worth $4,500,000. The parents who cut me off at 18 showed up grinning. Of course, we'll manage it for you. But when the judge read the next page, their smiles shattered. Hi, my name is Natalie Morgan. I am 29 years old and I live and work in Boston. But there is one memory I can never forget no matter how many years pass. The night I turned 18, the night my parents officially disowned me and forced me to leave the house where I grew up as if I were a stranger. That day was my high school graduation, which should have marked a milestone of growth filled with joy and pride, but for me it became the beginning of a pain that lasted for a decade. After the ceremony, I returned home feeling anxious yet faintly hopeful that at least my parents would offer a word of congratulations. That dinner was heavy, without a single congratulatory remark, without a smile. Before I could say anything, my father, Thomas, looked up with eyes cold as steel and declared bluntly, "You are 18 now. If you cannot support yourself, then get out of here." My heart dropped. Before I could understand what was happening, my mother, Linda, crossed her arms and, with a voice as sharp as a knife, said, "This family does not raise the ungrateful. We have done more than enough for you." I looked at my sister Sophia, hoping to find a trace of sympathy, but all that showed on her face was triumph. She held the keys to the brand new car our parents had just given her for her birthday, and on the table lay a formal acceptance letter for a full scholarship to a prestigious private school, placed there like a trophy. The difference between Sophia and me had never been clearer. I had only a worn backpack, a few sets of clothes, and less than $200 saved from weekend shifts at a coffee shop. While Sophia was cherished like a gem, I was a burden to be cast aside. I asked my parents why everything was so unfair, why I was never acknowledged, but my father only shook his head and said I had disappointed him, while my mother added that I was too weak, too sensitive, and would never be good enough to invest in. I bit my lip to hold back the tears and quietly packed my things. When I stepped outside, Boston was pouring rain as if the sky itself was grieving. I stood on the porch with my backpack clutched to my chest, looking back at the two-story house that once held so many childhood memories, now reduced to a cold wall. No one came to see me off. No one offered a word of good luck. Sophia was still busy taking pictures with the new car in the garage, and my parents closed the living room door as if ejecting me were a perfectly reasonable, unquestionable decision. I walked down the street, the rain slapping my face, sharp and numbing at once. In that moment, I understood I was no longer their daughter, only a name they wanted to erase from the family. A close friend drove an old sedan to pick me up. I sat in the back seat, unable to speak, staring out through the window. The streetlights blurred in the rain, mixing with the tears on my cheeks. That night, I slept in my friend's car, the rain tapping on the roof like a drum underscoring my loneliness. I curled up and listened to my heart pounding wildly, my mind tangled with 1,000 questions. Why was I never good enough? Why was my parents' love conditional? And how could a child be cast out simply for not meeting their expectations? I felt like I was falling into an abyss with no one reaching out to save me. The Boston cold seeped through my thin clothing, but colder still was the emptiness inside me. I thought back to the years before, and if any hand had held me steady through that storm, it was my grandmother's, Margaret Sullivan. She was nothing like anyone else in the Morgan family. There was a gentleness and patience in her that I had never seen in my parents, a quiet love that did not need to be wrapped in flashy gifts or boasted about to the world. While my parents viewed me as a burden, she saw me as a person growing, uneasy but full of potential. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of Cambridge, not far from downtown Boston, where the garden always smelled of apples and sparrows chattered every morning. Whenever I felt I could no longer bear my parents' contempt, I went to her, and her door was never closed to me. I remember those weekend afternoons when she would greet me with a warm hug and the smell of freshly baked apple pie drifting through the kitchen. I would sit at the wooden table by the window, peeling apples while she told me stories of her youth, when she too had to fight for the chance to attend college in a society full of prejudices against women. She would often smile, her eyes reflecting experience, and tell me, "You do not need their approval, you only need to write your own story." Every time I heard that, it felt like a battery being recharged inside me. While my parents' words made me feel worthless, her words reminded me that I still had the right to define my own value. There were evenings when she and I would read together in the living room. She sat in the old armchair while I curled up on the sofa under a wool blanket. She often picked heavy books about people who had overcome hardship to write their own destinies. When I showed signs of doubt, she would stop reading and say, "Do you see? None of them had an easy path. But it is hardship that shapes resilience." Those words gradually soaked into me, planting a seed of belief that even if I were cast out, I could still find my own way. Once, after a tiring shift at the cafe when I felt so discouraged I wanted to quit school, she sat with me in the garden littered with dry leaves. The air that day was sharp and the wind rushed through, but she patiently listened as I poured out all my resentment toward my parents and Sophia. After a long silence, she placed her hand on my shoulder and, in a warm, low voice, said, "You have the right to feel sorrow. But do not let that sorrow become a shackle. Turn it into wings that carry you farther." That sentence etched itself into my heart. Whenever I felt desperate, I would recall her sitting in the garden, her silver hair stirred by the wind, her steady eyes full of belief in me. I remember those weekend afternoons when she would greet me with a warm hug and the scent of freshly baked apple pie drifting through the kitchen. I would sit at the wooden table by the window, peeling apples while she told me stories of her youth, when she too had to fight for the chance to attend college in a society still full of prejudice against women. She would often smile, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of experience, and tell me, "You don't need their approval, just write your own story." Each time I heard that, I felt strengthened. While my parents' words made me feel worthless, her words reminded me that I still had the right to define my own worth. There were evenings when she and I read together in the living room. She sat in the old armchair while I curled up on the couch under a wool blanket. She often chose thick books about people who had overcome hardship to write their own destinies. When I showed signs of doubt, she would stop reading and say, "Do you see? None of them had an easy path. But it is hardship that creates resilience." Those words gradually sank into me, planting the belief that even if I were cast out, I could still find my own way. Once, after a shift at the cafe when I felt so discouraged I wanted to quit school, she sat with me in the garden strewn with dry leaves. The day was brisk and the wind rushed through. Yet she patiently listened as I poured out all my resentment toward my parents and Sophia. After a long silence, she placed her hand on my shoulder and, in a warm, low voice, said, "You have the right to be sad, but don't let that sadness become a shackle. Turn it into wings to fly farther." Those words etched themselves into my heart. Whenever I felt desperate, I would remember her sitting in the garden, her silver hair stirred by the wind, her steadfast eyes full of faith in me. It was not only her words of advice, she also gave me the feeling that I had a place to belong. On Thanksgiving, when my parents used excuses to avoid inviting me home, she would call and say, "Don't worry, there's always a place for you here." Her meals were simple roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, but to me, they were a rare warmth that made me forget what it felt like to be pushed aside. Sitting beside her, I no longer felt like the abandoned child, but like the granddaughter who was truly loved. Gradually, I realized that her love was what kept me from collapsing completely. Without her, I might have drowned in hatred or given up on everything. She taught me that real worth does not come from pleasing others, especially those who try to tear you down, but from persistence and belief in yourself. Whenever I left her house to face the harsh reality again, I carried with me the knowledge that at least one person believed in me, and that faith alone was enough to keep me moving forward. Now, looking back, I know that the small sums of money, the boxes of cookies, the afternoons in the garden, and her simple words were the foundation of the strength I would later use to confront my family and the world. It was not luxury or praise, but her quiet warmth, patience, and faith that nurtured me through the darkest years. And perhaps that is why I have never forgotten the words she repeated so often. "You don't need their approval, Just write your own story. It was not merely advice, it was the lantern that lit my path through the heavy darkness of being disowned at 18. I entered my 19th year with empty hands and a heart full of scars, but I knew that if I stopped, I would sink entirely into the darkness. After graduating high school with no financial support from my parents, I had to find my first part-time job to survive. I applied everywhere, from laundromats and corner stores to supermarkets, and in the end, the Starbucks near downtown Boston hired me. Making coffee was not a dream job, but it was a lifeline, enough to pay my rent and buy a few necessities for school. Each shift lasted 8 hours, the smell of coffee clinging to my hair and clothes, my hands marked by small burns from the steam wand, but I did not complain. I knew it was the price of independence. Balancing work and study proved harsher than I had imagined. I enrolled at a community college in Cambridge, starting with inexpensive foundational courses to accumulate credits. By day I attended classes, taking notes diligently and fighting to stay awake. By night I put on the green apron and stood behind the counter serving customers. Many nights after a 10 o'clock shift, I dragged myself back to a tiny rented room with a rickety wooden desk piled high with books. I opened my laptop, my eyes blurred with fatigue, yet forced myself to finish the essays. Sleeplessness became a habit, dark circles under my eyes deepening like evidence of those uncertain months. Rent was always a nightmare. I shared a small apartment with 2 other students, crammed into a space barely big enough for 3 beds and a single electric stove. Each month, after paying rent, utilities, and buying a little food, my bank account was nearly empty. Once, I had to choose between buying a math textbook or paying the electric bill, and I chose the book. That night, I studied in complete darkness, with only the glow of the street lamp filtering through the window. As the air grew stifling, I thought of my grandmother's words. "Do not let sorrow become a shackle, turn it into wings." And I knew I was not allowed to give up. While I struggled to pay bills, Sophia lived a life that was the complete opposite. I did not have to seek it out, she flaunted every glamorous moment on social media. While I sat in the library with a cheap box of ramen, Sophia posted pictures from Paris, standing under the Eiffel Tower in an expensive silk dress. While I picked up extra shifts just to afford train fare to school, she shared photos from Italy, savoring gelato by the canals of Venice. My parents not only paid her full tuition at an elite private school, but also gave her a brand new car so she could conveniently experience the world. Every photo, every caption, felt like a knife twisting deeper, reminding me that in their eyes, I had never been worthy. Sometimes, on days when I thought I had finally escaped the shadow of my family, a message from my mother would drag me back into bitter reality. "The Morgan daughter is truly disgraceful," she wrote, attaching a photo of Sophia receiving an award at school. Or it would be my father's half-mocking, half-pitying tone. "If you worked half as hard as Sophia, you wouldn't be serving coffee to strangers." Those words cut deep, but I learned not to respond. I realized that my silence was the only way to keep from being pulled into their cycle of manipulation. Even so, I cannot deny there were moments when I nearly broke. One winter night, after a late shift, I sat in my freezing room with tears streaming down my face, unable to stop them. I thought of my grandmother, of those evenings we spent reading together, and felt hollow at the thought that I was now utterly alone. Yet it was the memory of her that pulled me back up. I reopened the notes she had once given me, one of which read, "True worth does not come from anyone's praise, but from what you overcome." I gripped that slip of paper as if it were the thread connecting me to an unseen source of strength. During those years, I learned how to survive hardship. I learned to account for every dollar, to live simply while still holding on to my dignity. I learned not to crumble under contempt, and more importantly, I came to understand that resilience is not something you are born with but something forged through sleepless nights and repeated failures. When I completed my 2 years at community college and transferred to the University of Massachusetts, it was more than just an academic step forward. It was proof that I could break free from the labels my parents had placed on me. 4 relentless years of working and studying etched into me a strength no amount of indulgence could ever produce. I graduated with a degree in economics, without overwhelming debt, and above all, with faith in myself. What Sophia had been handed so easily by our parents' support, I had earned with sweat, tears, and the blood of my heart. And looking back, I realized that those difficult years had transformed me into someone they never expected, a Natalie Morgan who was resilient, steadfast, and no longer so easily crushed by the disdain of her family. At 29, after more than a decade of struggling on my own, I had built a life that, from the outside, many might see as modest, but to me it was an achievement. I worked as a financial analyst for a consulting firm in downtown Boston. The job was not glamorous, but it was steady, with a salary that allowed me to maintain a small apartment in the South End, pay utilities on time, and occasionally treat myself to dinner at the Italian restaurant near the office. The apartment had just 2 rooms, a small bedroom with a single bed and a living room that doubled as my workspace. On the bookshelf, I still kept the old novels my grandmother had given me. Each time I looked at them, I remembered the smell of apple pie filling her Cambridge kitchen, and her warm, steady voice urging me through those darkest years. Just when I began to feel that everything was finally falling into place, one autumn afternoon, my world collapsed. My phone buzzed while I was reviewing spreadsheets at work. On the other end was a distant relative I had not spoken to in years. Their voice broke as they told me. My grandmother Margaret had passed away that morning, in her sleep, at the age of 82. I froze, my hands turning cold. I had prepared myself in some way, knowing her age and fragile health, but the news still cut through me like a blade. She was the only family member I still felt connected to, the anchor that had kept me from falling into the abyss throughout my youth. Losing her felt like losing the last thread tying me to something called family. That night, I sat quietly in my small apartment, watching red maple leaves drift past the window. I made myself a cup of tea but could not bring myself to drink it. Memories flooded in, her hand resting on my shoulder in the Cambridge garden, the notebook pages filled with her teachings, the resolute look in her eyes when she told me I did not need anyone's approval. I wondered if she knew that I still was not as strong as she had hoped I would become. Tears streamed down my face, and for the first time in years, I cried like a child. 2 days later, I received an unexpected call from a law office number. A middle-aged man's voice came through clear and professional. "Hello, Miss Natalie Morgan? This is Daniel Thompson, the attorney representing Mrs. Margaret Sullivan. I'm calling to inform you that you need to attend the will reading. The meeting will take place next week at the Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston." I was stunned. I had never considered the possibility of an inheritance, nor did I dare hope that she would leave anything to me. To me, what she had given throughout her life, her love, patience, and faith, was everything. But when he mentioned the will, my heart raced. I understood I would have to face a truth I had always avoided. My parents and Sophia would almost certainly be there. I had been estranged from them for 11 years, with no reunions, no embraces, only scattered sarcastic messages and the flashy photos they posted. I knew them well enough to know they would not pass up any chance to grab whatever of value they could from her estate. The thought of sitting in the same room, listening to them feign sorrow while their eyes flashed with greed, sent a chill down my spine. After the call, I sat motionless for a long time, the phone lying on the table, the screen gone dark without my noticing. A jumble of questions crowded my mind. Had she left me anything, or only a few mementos? Would my parents try to manipulate the situation as they had throughout my childhood? And most importantly, would I be strong enough to face them after years of running away? I stepped out onto the balcony and breathed in the sharp early winter air of Boston. The city below glittered with lights, skyscrapers reflected on the Charles River. I told myself I had survived the worst days, had endured by relying on resilience and the memory of her. There was no reason to collapse now. But deep down, I was trembling. Life had never been fair to me, and I understood that the upcoming will reading would not just be a legal formality, it would be a fateful confrontation. After 11 years of running from a toxic family, I was now forced to return, to face the very faces that had cast me out into the rain when I was 18. I knew things would no longer be simple. And in that moment, an intuition rose within me. Whatever truth my grandmother had left behind in her will would change everything not only for me, but for the entire Morgan family. That morning, I stepped across the worn stone steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse, my heart heavy. The building loomed in solemn grandeur, with its dark wooden doors, arched ceilings, and the faint scent of aged timber lingering in the air, as though it had borne witness to countless family disputes and broken promises. Clutching my handbag tightly, I drew a deep breath before entering the conference room, where the fate of Margaret Sullivan's estate would be revealed. In my heart, I knew I was not just there to hear a will. I was there to confront the faces I had spent 11 years trying to avoid. The conference room was paneled with old wood, rows of leather chairs lined up neatly, and a long polished table glowing under the soft golden lights. As I stepped inside, my heart sank. My parents were already seated with Sophia. The three of them looked as though they were dressed for a gala, not to honor someone who had just passed away. My father, Thomas, wore a gray pinstripe suit with a glaring red tie, sitting upright with an air of pride. My mother, Linda, draped in an old Chanel coat still ostentatious enough to flaunt, had her face carefully made up, lips curved in a false smile. Sophia, as always, radiated in her form-fitting navy dress, her blonde curls falling in perfect waves, her eyes gleaming with calculated intent. I chose a seat a few chairs away from them, but there was no escaping their scrutinizing eyes. My mother spoke first, her voice dripping with unnatural sweetness. "Natalie, don't worry. Whatever your grandmother left behind, we'll manage it for you. You're still young, and you don't have the experience to handle numbers that large." She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with condescension. My father added, "That's right, let us guide you, and you'll avoid foolish mistakes." His booming tone carried the same authority he had once wielded over the family. Sophia sat with her legs crossed, flicked her hair back over her shoulder, and smirked. "You've never had money to manage anyway, since you never had a dime to your name." The words were wrapped in a soft laugh, but I heard the humiliation sharp and clear. My heart burned, but I restrained myself, keeping my face composed. I knew exactly what they were doing, trying to dominate, to belittle, to force me back into the role of the powerless child I once was. As the tension thickened, Attorney Daniel Thompson entered. He wore a simple black suit, carrying a thick file in his hand, his expression stern yet calm. Taking his seat, he opened his briefcase and placed the stack of documents on the table. The room fell silent, the tick of the wall clock echoing loudly. His deep, steady voice filled the air. "According to the legal will of Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, signed in this very office on May 12th of last year, the entirety of her estate, including real property, securities, bank accounts, and personal assets valued at approximately $4,500,000 US, shall be transferred in full to her only granddaughter, Natalie Morgan." The air seemed to freeze. I nearly held my breath as each heavy word echoed in my head. In that moment, I felt my grandmother's whisper at my ear. "You don't need their approval, just write your own story." Across from me, the three faces changed color almost instantly. The smug smile on my mother's lips stiffened, her lipstick seeming to slip from the edge. My father went rigid, his hand on his knee trembling slightly, the red tie looking absurd under the pallid light. Sophia, who usually knew how to hide her feelings, could not hold it this time. Her jaw dropped, her eyes widened, and for a brief second she looked stunned. The room sank into silence, broken only by the soft rustle of paper. Daniel continued reading, his voice decisive. "The will not only names Natalie Morgan as the sole heir, but also explicitly states that there shall be no form of trust, guardianship, or intermediary management. The entire estate, decision-making authority, and associated benefits shall be vested wholly in Miss Natalie." He looked up, fixing his gaze on me, then swept his eyes across my parents and Sophia. In that look, I saw clearly. My grandmother had prepared for this, and he was the one chosen to stand on my side. A wave of relief mixed with overwhelm flooded my chest. All these years I had never dared dream of a moment when the scales would tip in my favor. I had resigned myself to always being the cast-off daughter, living in Sophia's shadow. But now the truth was public. My grandmother had chosen me. Not them. Not the ones who only flaunted and controlled. Me. The silence after Attorney Thompson finished reading the will stretched taut like a wire. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding, mingled with the uneven breaths of those sitting across from me. My mother was the first to shatter it, and, just as I expected, she immediately slipped into her familiar mask, the facade of a caring mother. Her voice was soft, but the strain was unmistakable. "Natalie, sweetheart, I know this news might feel overwhelming. $4.5 million is no small amount. You're still young, without experience. Your father and I only want to help you manage it so you don't make mistakes. Trust me, we only want what's best for you." I stared at her without a word. I knew too well how they dressed up control as care, how they draped themselves in the role of protectors while always being the ones pulling the strings. My father, Thomas, quickly chimed in as if to reinforce the script my mother had begun. He emphasized each word, his booming voice carrying like a speech before a boardroom. "Natalie, you may be smart in your current job, but you've never handled large sums of money. If you're not careful, this fortune will make you a target for scammers or worse, you'll waste it all in just a few years. Let me step in on your behalf. I have financial experience, I know how to invest, I know how to preserve wealth. That is the most reasonable choice." I bit down on my lip to keep from letting out a bitter laugh. The man who had once thrown me out of the house with nothing but a backpack and a few $100s now sat there, boldly proclaiming himself the guardian of my inheritance. All my life, he had never once thought of protecting me, and yet now, with money on the table, he suddenly transformed into a seasoned, responsible protector. Sophia, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike, leaned forward, her voice sweet but laced with mockery. "Little sister, I'm only being honest. You've never known how to manage money. Remember high school? You begged Grandma for extra cash because you wasted all your part-time earnings on nonsense. You cried so pitifully. Do you really think you're any different now? Mom and Dad are just trying to save you from embarrassing yourself." Each word they spoke was like a sharp blade, aimed at old memories, tearing open wounds I had struggled so hard to bury. But instead of fighting back, I sat still. I refused to give them the satisfaction of any reaction. I kept my face calm, my eyes fixed on Attorney Thompson, as if their taunts did not exist. Yet inside, heat surged through my chest, waves of anger crashing hard. I could feel my nails digging into my palms, leaving deep marks in my skin. With the composure of someone who had witnessed scenes like this countless times, Attorney Thompson adjusted his glasses and tapped his pen lightly on the table to restore order. His voice was firm and precise. "Excuse me, but everything just said has no bearing on the legal validity of this will. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan signed the document in a fully sound state of mind, in the presence of both an attorney and a physician. The will clearly states that the entire estate is transferred directly to the sole heir, Miss Natalie Morgan, with no clause permitting guardianship or third-party management. This is the absolute intention of the deceased. I expect everyone here to respect that." The statement fell like a hammer. I watched my parents' faces shift. My father leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched tight, while my mother forced a crooked smile, her eyes flashing with helplessness. Sophia bit down on her lip so hard her lipstick smeared, her hands clutching her purse as if it were the only thing keeping her from exploding right there in the room. And I remained silent. That silence was not weakness, nor fear of fighting back, but a clarity I had earned. Every word they spoke only revealed their greed and deceit. My silence became a mirror, forcing them to see the shamelessness in their own reflection. I lowered my gaze to the file in front of me, breathing slowly to restrain the fury boiling inside. My chest burned, but my face stayed calm, cold even. I knew they would not stop. I knew this was only the beginning of a long chain of schemes yet to come. But right now, seeing the awkwardness, the hastily covered defeat flicker across their faces, I felt a glimmer of light pierce through the darkness that had shadowed 11 years of my life. They could fake smiles, they could wield every manipulative tactic, but this time the scales were no longer tilted in their favor. And I swore to myself I would never again let them seize control. Just a few days later, as I returned home from work to my small South End apartment, I found Sophia waiting at my door, arms folded, her high heels tapping against the hallway floor as if she owned the place. For a moment, I froze. Her golden hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, the heavy scent of expensive perfume filling the air, an image crafted to remind the world she belonged to something glamorous. "We need to talk," Sophia said the instant I approached. Her voice was soft, but every word carried that ingrained arrogance. I slowly unlocked the door, offering no invitation, but she walked in unbothered, her eyes sweeping over the apartment with disdain. "Cute," she sneered, "but we both know you can't possibly handle that kind of money alone. You have no investment sense, no vision, you'll only disappoint Grandma." I quietly took off my coat, hung it on the rack, and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I forced myself to stay calm, though inside I felt a fire blazing. Sophia pressed on, her sharp eyes glittering. "Honestly, you should let Mom, Dad, and me help. We have the experience, the connections. You can't handle this on your own. If you keep insisting, you'll ruin everything." She spoke as if that money were communal property, as if I were nothing more than a temporary custodian. I turned and looked her straight in the eye, saying nothing, letting silence fill the room. I knew any words I spoke would be twisted, reshaped into excuses for them to keep manipulating. Sophia could not bear that silence. She exhaled sharply, dropping her voice a tone lower, pretending at magnanimity. "Listen, Natalie. You don't need to fight the family, we're blood. Why turn us into enemies? Mom and Dad only want to help you." I suppressed a bitter laugh, my mind flashing back to that rainy night when I was 18, when they shoved me out of the house without a backward glance. And now, they dared invoke blood to force me into surrendering everything. Absurd. I gave no reply, only opened the door to signal her out. For a moment, her eyes flickered with unease, but she quickly recovered her cold composure and stepped into the hallway. Just before turning away, she delivered one final line. "Don't be stupid, Natalie. You can't hold on to this alone." Then the echo of her heels rang down the long corridor, leaving the apartment steeped in heavy silence. I thought that visit had only been a scare tactic. But just a few days later, a phone call from the bank shook me to my core. The branch manager's voice came through the line. "Miss Morgan, we need to confirm something. This morning someone came in claiming to be your representative, presenting certain documents, and requesting access to the inheritance fund. According to our system, you alone hold the legal right." We denied their request, but they were very insistent. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I didn't need to ask who it was. Only my parents would be brazen enough to try something like that, to impersonate me and attempt to withdraw funds as if they had the right. A surge of anger rose in me, mixed with humiliation. They not only disrespected me, but also disrespected the will itself, trampling on my grandmother's wishes. In their eyes, I had never been an independent person. I was only an obstacle standing between them and money. That night, I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out something I had kept for 8 years, a letter my grandmother Margaret had written to me on my 21st birthday. The paper had yellowed, the handwriting a little shaky, but every line was still clear. "My dearest Natalie, if one day they try to take from you what does not belong to them, remember that you owe them nothing. You need not feel guilty for keeping what I leave to you. All of it is because I trust you, not them. Bye." I read it again and again, my tears falling, blurring the ink. Her voice came alive in my ears, as if she were right beside me, her hand on my shoulder, reminding me I was not alone. Her words were my shield, the flame rekindled in my heart. The deceit and schemes the Morgan family wove no longer frightened me. I knew this battle had only just begun, and I also knew I would not back down. I would stand tall. I would protect what she had left me not just for its material value, but because it was the inheritance of her love and the faith she had placed in me. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my wallet, as if it were a talisman. Lifting my gaze to the apartment window, I saw Boston at night, the golden lights stretching across the surface of the Charles River. In that moment, the path ahead became clear, difficult, full of traps, but I was no longer the 18-year-old girl trembling in the rain. I was Natalie Morgan, and this time, I would not let anyone steal the story of my life ever again. After the call from the bank and the old letter from my grandmother warming my heart like a flame, I knew I had to do more than simply wait. I needed the truth. I needed to know just how far she had prepared for me. So the next morning, I went to the office of attorney Daniel Harris, a man introduced as both an old friend and longtime colleague of Margaret Sullivan. His office was housed in an old red brick building near Copley Square, with tall glass windows and wooden shelves stacked high with files. The atmosphere was solemn yet warm, as if the walls themselves had witnessed countless family stories rewritten by law. Daniel Harris was a man in his 50s, with graying hair, a tall, lean frame, and a slow, resonant voice. He rose to shake my hand as I entered, his eyes carrying both understanding and a touch of sympathy. "Natalie, I've been looking forward to meeting you," he said. "Margaret spoke of you often. She was always proud of her granddaughter's strength and resilience." I sat down in the leather chair, feeling a measure of comfort at his words. After days of being attacked by my family, to hear that she had always thought of me was a profound reassurance. Daniel opened a thick file and pushed it toward me. "Your grandmother did not leave only a will. She also set up a legal layer of protection, carefully calculated. Margaret was not blind to the greed of her son and daughter-in-law. On the contrary, she saw through them long ago. And she knew that one day they would try to seize the assets." I listened intently, every word hitting the premonition I had felt inside. He explained that beyond the formal, notarized will, Margaret had created a robust legal structure with numerous supplemental clauses. There were provisions that specified, if any family member including Thomas, Linda, or Sophia attempted to interfere, forge documents, litigate, or otherwise appropriate the estate, they would be completely disqualified from any inheritance rights. Not only would they lose their share, they could also face prosecution for fraud or unlawful interference with property. I shivered at the thought, both amazed and full of admiration. She had thought of everything. Daniel continued, "She once told me, 'My daughter and her husband care only about reputation and money, but Natalie is different. She knows true worth is not about appearances.' I do not want Natalie to suffer additional wounds from her own family after I'm gone. So she prepared this shield years ago. The conditions are explicit, the paperwork is lawful, and there is medical certification confirming her sound mind when the will was executed. They can scheme all they like, but they will not be able to break it." I sat in silence, emotions welling up inside me. All the years I had believed I was merely the pitying granddaughter, it turned out she had quietly built an entire fortress to protect me. It was not by chance that she left everything to me, not out of pity, but because she had seen, had chosen, and had trusted me. Daniel stood up, walked to the bookshelf behind him, and took down a leather-bound notebook, its cover softened by the years. He placed it in front of me, his eyes solemn. "This is what she wanted me to give to you at the right time, and I believe that time is now." I reached out with trembling hands and opened the book. Her familiar handwriting appeared, careful and at times slightly shaky, yet still full of life. The first pages recorded small memories, the apple pie recipe, a few notes about the Cambridge garden, and some of her favorite quotations. But as I turned further, my chest tightened. She had written out predictions of how my parents and Sophia would behave. "Thomas will try to prove I was not of sound mind when I made the will. Linda will claim Natalie coerced me into changing my wishes. Sophia will use contempt to weaken Natalie's resolve. But all of these will be false, and I write these words while my mind is clear, to prove I know what I am doing." My hand shook as I read those lines. Each word felt as if she were speaking to me directly, as if she had foreseen the scene unfolding in the courtroom and wanted to leave a final message. On another page, she wrote, "If they try to take what does not belong to them, that is precisely why I chose Natalie. She has endured too much, and only she understands the true value of this legacy." I bit my lip and let the tears fall, the room filling with the echo of her voice from the past. Daniel sat quietly as I finished reading, then spoke gently. "Natalie, your grandmother did not leave you only money. She left you her faith and a responsibility. You have the right to protect it, and I will be here to help you. We will face whatever actions they take, and remember, she prepared for all of this." I closed the notebook and held it against my chest as if cradling a piece of her soul. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the lone figure standing against my entire family. I had the shield my grandmother left behind: the documents, the legal provisions, and most importantly, her foresight and her absolute trust in me. The fear within me began to give way to resolve. I knew the battle was not over. My parents had already filed suit, but this time I would step into the courtroom as someone who had been prepared for a very long time. On the morning of the hearing, Boston's sky hung heavy with clouds, a gray curtain pulled low over the Charles River. With my grandmother's notebook tucked safely in my bag, I crossed the stone steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse. The corridor stretched long, its dark wooden panels and thin bands of yellow light pressing down on my chest like tightening ropes. The courtroom was solemn, the gallery crowded with curious faces of reporters and onlookers. When I raised my head, I saw my parents and Sophia already seated across from me with their attorney. My father's suit was pressed to perfection, my mother's silk scarf matched precisely to her lipstick, and Sophia, as always, was immaculate down to each curl of her hair. Together they radiated a self-assured arrogance, as if the verdict were already theirs. I drew a deep breath, hearing the pounding of my own heart, the memory of that rainy night at 18 spilling across my mind like streaks of water on a windshield, then fading as I turned to Daniel Harris. He met my gaze with a calm nod, just enough to steady me, to remind me that I was not walking into this alone. The plaintiff's attorney rose first, his voice booming, spinning out a narrative I had anticipated but still felt a chill hearing spoken aloud. His opening argument. The will was invalid because Margaret lacked mental capacity at the time of signing. He held up a thick folder, citing medical visits and vague notes about memory lapses, skillfully planting in the courtroom the suggestion that my grandmother had been confused, subject to moments of diminished clarity. The second argument. I had exerted undue influence by cutting off contact with the rest of the family to monopolize access, by exploiting an ailing woman's condition to persuade her to rewrite the will in my favor. I heard every word: exploit, manipulate, and watched a few heads in the gallery tilt, as if those words carried a gravity that shifted the story toward them. When the attorney called Sophia to the stand, she strode confidently down the aisle, her heels striking with purpose, then swore to tell the truth with such solemnity I almost laughed. Sophia painted her picture carefully, that I often closed the door to whisper with Grandma, that I suddenly appeared when she was frail, that before that, Natalie rarely bothered to ask about her. Every line was dressed in emotion, punctuated with furrowed brows and well-timed pauses, as if she had rehearsed it all in front of a mirror. And for a moment, the whole room leaned toward that version of the story, the stubborn, greedy granddaughter, cunning enough to manipulate the elderly. I sat still, listening as I was turned into the guilty party in my own family's story, while the memories of nights I made chicken soup for my grandmother, of afternoons reading together in the Cambridge living room, were twisted into evidence of my so-called monopolizing her. For a fragile moment, a dark spark crossed my mind. What if the court believed them? What if, after everything I had survived, my dignity was crushed once more, this time in the very place people called justice? I heard a chair shift lightly behind me, the scratch of a reporter's pen on paper, and I almost wanted to shrink in on myself until the feeling passed. I turned to Daniel. His eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. I thought of my grandmother's letter, the line that read, "You owe them nothing," And I drew a deep breath, pulling the fear back into its rightful place as shadow, not my truth. When it was the defense's turn, Daniel did not rush. He rose, straightened his file, and spoke in a low but resonant voice. "Your Honor, this case is not about truth, it is about greed." He let a brief silence hang, as though peeling away the moral veil the plaintiffs had just tried to drape over the room. Then he began laying down the evidence piece by piece, like bricks into a solid foundation. First came the official medical report, signed by my grandmother's personal physician, the very doctor who was present the day she signed the will, affirming that she was fully lucid, understood both the value of her estate and the legal consequences, and made her choice of heir independently. Next, Daniel presented the bank report, a record detailing the exact time, the names of those who made contact, and the nature of their request to access the inheritance fund. On the page stood out clearly the names Thomas Morgan and Linda Morgan, identifying themselves as my representatives and attempting to withdraw and transfer funds. This evidence not only dismantled their claim of concern, but also cast a harsh light on their true motives. Next, Daniel presented the emails and handwritten letters sent to me after the will, reading polite proposals asking me to authorize, to share, to place everything under family management for the sake of unity. The words were courteous on the surface, but the spine of each was coercion, and he pointed out precisely how the phrasing had been crafted to strip control from me. He then displayed a string of messages from Sophia, where she sneered that money belongs to those who know how to use it, hinting at the so-called family investment network as the only way to ensure Grandma's money doesn't go to waste. Each line exposed not concern, but entitlement. Finally, Daniel lifted the faded leather notebook, opening to the very page bearing my grandmother's familiar handwriting. He read slowly, giving each word room to sink into the polished wood of the bench. Thomas will claim I was not of sound mind. Linda will say Natalie forced me to change the will. Sophia will use mockery to weaken her. But I wrote this will with complete clarity. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I chose Natalie because she understands the true value of what I leave behind. End. He looked up, and then, like the strike of a gavel, spoke the line I had memorized, but which still sent shivers down my spine when it rang through the courtroom. If they try to take what does not belong to them, that is precisely why I chose Natalie. The room seemed suddenly drained of air. I heard the papers stop rustling, pens stop scratching, and an invisible gap widened between the two sides, a new boundary drawn. Daniel requested permission to play a short audio recording of the physician's testimony, the steady voice of a middle-aged man, confirming that my grandmother had undergone a cognitive exam on the very day of signing, answering accurately all questions about time, place, the nature of her assets, and the beneficiary she had chosen. A textbook example of testamentary capacity. The eyes in the gallery shifted, slowly but unmistakably. Where doubt had hovered moments before, there now glowed a quiet indignation directed not at me, but at them. The effect on my family was immediate. My father, who always spoke with the crisp authority of a boardroom, flushed crimson and tried to force out a clumsy defense, only to become tangled in his own words. My mother, a master of well-timed tears, brought a hand to her eyes, but her voice trembled and no longer flowed smoothly. "We only want what's best for the girl." The final syllable falling into an awkward silence as she caught the disapproving glance of someone seated behind her. And Sophia, who had always walked the fine line between confidence and arrogance with perfect balance, now hung her head, her hands gripping the edge of her skirt, her shoulders shivering as if caught in a cold wind. The judge, a woman in her 50s with the clear-eyed patience of someone who has heard too many broken family stories, called for order and leaned forward. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for emotional residue. This court has reviewed the evidence. First, the will of Mrs. Margaret Sullivan is lawful, made while she was of sound mind and possessing the testamentary capacity required by law. Second, there is no evidence that Miss Natalie Morgan exerted undue influence. On the contrary, the documents showing attempts to access the bank, the letters demanding authorization, and the messages indicating efforts to intervene point to a motive of appropriation by the plaintiffs. She paused, swept her gaze across my parents' faces, then struck the gavel lightly. The suit is dismissed. The court warns the Morgan family against any further actions aimed at obstructing the execution of the will. The estate shall vest fully in Miss Natalie Morgan in accordance with the decedent's intentions. I sat motionless as if my body needed a few seconds to catch up with the realities sealed by that gavel. Tears flowed, but they no longer tasted of shame or despair. They were the salty relief of a deep exoneration. Final vindication after years of being branded, the disgrace, after nights spent proving to myself that I was not the useless shadow in my family. I stood, steadied my breath, and tightened my grip on the strap of my bag where my grandmother's notebook lay quietly, warm like a second heartbeat. On my way out, I glimpsed my parents bowing their heads and Sophia avoiding my eyes, and in that instant my grandmother's voice rang inside me, startlingly close to the ear. "You did it." I nodded softly, not to show off to anyone, but as an answer to her, to the 18-year-old girl in that rainy night long ago. That from now on, I would not let anyone else write the next chapter of my life. The trial's end did more than close a lawsuit. It felt like the final door shutting on the long years I had been trapped in the shadow of the Morgan family. After the ruling, Boston's newspapers lit up with coverage. Not because I had inherited $4.5 million, this city was no stranger to enormous estates, but because of the nature of the case, parents suing their own daughter over her grandmother's will, only to be dismissed outright with a stern warning from the court. The Boston Globe even ran the headline, "Will upheld justice for the granddaughter once cast aside." The story spread quickly, and the fallout for my parents was anything but gentle. Within their circles of friends and colleagues, the reputations my father and mother had cultivated for decades began to unravel. At the cocktail parties, my father once adored gatherings where logistics, executives, clinked glasses, and discussed contracts. The room now fell silent when he entered. Eyes avoided him, whispers rose behind his back. The company where he served as a manager faced public pressure, and the board forced him into early retirement under the pretext of protecting the image. My mother, once respected as a model teacher, now endured sharp glances from fellow educators and the parents of her students. Whispers followed her too. If a mother can sue her own daughter, what values is she teaching our children? Once seen as a woman of elegance in the community, she became a symbol of greed, her polished exterior unable to disguise what lay beneath. Sophia, the once crowned golden star of the Morgan family, didn't escape the spiral either. Her longtime boyfriend, from a well-established family, quietly ended things after the court transcripts and media coverage laid bare her role as a fabricated witness. The career opportunities she flaunted so often online began to evaporate one by one. No firm wanted to be associated with someone branded as a false witness under oath. In the end, Sophia had no choice but to pack her bags and move back into the very house where, 11 years earlier, they had cast me out into the rain. As for me, I never used this legal victory as a weapon for revenge. I didn't call them. I didn't taunt them. I didn't deliver the accusations that might have been justified. Instead, I chose silence not out of fear, but out of freedom. I simply kept walking forward, on the path my grandmother had trusted me to take. I returned to my work as a financial analyst, but alongside it, I began pouring my time and heart into something greater: the Margaret Sullivan Foundation. With part of the inheritance, I created scholarships for students from fractured or disadvantaged homes, those who, like me once upon a time, knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the very people meant to protect them. I worked on community projects in Cambridge, where my grandmother's garden had once bloomed, helping restore the public library and launching children's reading circles. Ironically, it was these efforts, not the money, not the headlines, that finally earned me recognition that mattered. Not applause, not envy, but the shining eyes of a little boy pressing the keys of his first computer in a refurbished classroom. The trembling handwriting of a freshman girl who sent me a note. "Natalie, I won't give up. Thank you for believing in me." Those moments clarified everything. Inheritance isn't measured in wealth, but in the responsibility to carry forward a legacy of love. One autumn evening, as golden leaves blanketed the streets of Boston, I drove past my childhood home. The white-painted house still stood there, its wooden fence weathered, the upstairs windows glowing with their familiar warm light. Yet to me, it was nothing but empty. I pulled over on the opposite side of the street and sat quietly for a few minutes. 11 years ago, that house had been an open wound that would never heal, the place where an 18-year-old girl was cast out into the rain with nothing but a worn backpack. But now, as I looked again, I no longer felt pain. What I saw was a closed door, a finished chapter. No hatred remained, only release. I let a small smile rise to my lips, turned the key in the ignition, and drove away, leaving that house behind as a relic of the past. In my heart, my grandmother's voice echoed once more, like a melody I had always known. You don't need their approval, you only need to write your own story. And now I understood I had done just that. I was no longer the trembling girl in the storm, nor the castaway living under a shadow of rejection. I was Natalie Morgan, the one who rose from the wound of 18, who stood firm to protect her grandmother's legacy, and above all, the one who finally found her way back to herself.